Ich bin froh, dass ich hier bin. Beim Frühstück noch. Und also Afterparty. Nee, nur die erste. Welcome everybody. Happy to see that many faces at this early hour. I'm happy to be here myself, that I could make it. So I hope Thank you. So I hope everybody who has a really great time, had a really great time at Andretti's yesterday, please. Yeah, awesome. And who had a great time at the after party afterwards? Not so many, and a little bit more quiet. Okay, get that. And the party after that. Okay, awesome. So we will conclude this awesome K-Scope 18 with these concluding talks. Let's wrap this together. So this is a really neat format where we have 6 great speakers giving us a small insight for 10 to 12 minutes, and this is really entertaining as it has always been the years before. And this will also be live streamed at this URL, so please take photos, tweet, retweet, whatever, so that even more people can join and hopefully become a little bit jealous about this great community so that they want to join us next year in Seattle just as well. So first I would like to give kudos to the content team which has helped me select and create this wonderful APEX content for this conference, to select that. We had really some hard decisions to make because we had 154 submissions in the APEX track, of which we could only select 44, and in addition to that we had a number of sessions from the APEX team itself. They did the whole Sunday symposium, just team members of the APEX team, and they also had 8 sessions throughout the week. And this is also something which sets K-Scope apart from other conferences. Here you have the most speakers from the APEX team. You can get in touch with them. They're really responsive and not just to keep. So and it's really best to learn it from the horse's mouth. So I had a great team, everybody an expert in their own right. Gemma Wood, Karen Cannell, Christoph Ripprich, Dimitri Gielis, Martin de Sousa, Morten Braten, Niels de Bruyn, Peter Raganitsch, Vincent Morneau, Menno Hoogendijk, Roel Hartman, Scott Spendolini. I was lucky and proud to actually head the team, and Jorge Rimblas, he was heading and coordinating the database and the APEX track together. So often we see people doing JavaScript with APEX. They copy paste stuff from the internet and don't really understand what's going on. And sooner or later they create a mess and almost kill themselves, right? So we want to give you some guidance on how to avoid that and how to properly use JavaScript with APEX, because we got to face it, sooner or later you have to use JavaScript at some point. But how can you effectively leverage that with APEX? So first of all, Oracle ACE Director Peter Raganitsch will set the ground rules. Not always will you actually have to use JavaScript and jump out of the box. In many cases, what you get with dynamic actions and other things is already enough. But once you start going down that route, you have so many different ways of using JavaScript in your APEX application, and he will show us which the best ones are. So, Peter, you'll have 12 minutes.
So, it's on? Is it on? Really? Okay. So, Dietmar, thank you for stealing all my content. This is what I summarized, what I prepared. Anyway, you having a good time here? Yes. Great conference? Awesome. So, I went to a study group yesterday night for a long time to set up this talk. And I just realized I love ADF. It's awesome. What? It's the APEX development framework. Is there anything else? No. All right, anyway. Don't use any JavaScript. Thank you. All right, so I'm being very, very honest about it. I love JavaScript. I love to enhance APEX, but you really shouldn't do it unless you have to. Stick to the standard as long as possible. Explore APEX. It has so many great features out of the box. Use classic reports, use templates, use dynamic actions before you even consider using any kind of custom code, because whatever code you write, you own. That means you have to maintain it. Next version of APEX comes out, boom, you will be there looking at your code again and trying to understand what you did the first time. So when you go just to some blog and copy-paste fancy-looking JavaScript code, it is dangerous. This totally can backfire. So it is actually a good practice to stick to the standard as close as possible. But if your requirement is a bit more, then, and only then, if you try to use all the features and functions of APEX, then you can start to use JavaScript. And then you have to do it right. So, because every line of code you write, there is a bug in it. Maybe not one bug per line, but you see those statistics. It's across all languages. In every 1,000 lines of code, there are 20 to 50 bugs. It's the truth. So whenever you write JavaScript code or any other kind of custom code in your application, there might be a bug in it. So you say, so what? So I'll go back and fix it. But once you fix it, it's a new line of code, right? There is a new bug. So it happened to me before. I don't know about you, but I'm really good in introducing bugs. I love that. So anyway, if you need to use any kind of custom code, JavaScript, some custom CSS, HTML, whatever, how do you do it? Who is around who started before version 4 of APEX? All right, okay. So you probably learned it the wrong way. And I didn't know, I like documentation, but I didn't know there's actually a chapter in the APEX doc about how to include JavaScript code in your application. And it's, it almost tells you good things. So anyway, where to put JavaScript code? You can see that page designer. So you figure, hell what? I'll just chuck a region on page 0, the global page, and include JavaScript code there. Is this a good idea? It might or might not be a good idea, right? There are some exceptions, but in general, don't do stuff like that. Introduce static regions and put JavaScript code in there. Nobody knows it. You might remember, but the next developer stepping in, he might not look for any custom JavaScript code in a static region. And this is what we used to do all the time in, I think, APEX 3 and John here, not. The post text attribute of the page item, you can chuck in all kind of dirty stuff in there. And then earlier, APEX 2, 3, it was a great attribute. All the other fancy stuff didn't exist, so we chucked everything in here. And you shouldn't do it, right? A really good and clean way to store JavaScript code is, for example, in your user interface attributes. Who doesn't know what a user interface is? Okay. So, if you need JavaScript code in all of your application, this is a good place to put it. You can reference files from your web server or even static files inside your application. That's a great spot. If this doesn't work, if you need JavaScript code just on a single page, you can go to the page settings and declaratively reference your JavaScript files in here, or even check in some functions just for this one specific page. So don't do anything dirty, just try to be a really good and clean developer and just use the right attributes. If the thing you want to put JavaScript code into is not labeled as JavaScript, don't use it. No post text, no header attributes or anything like that. It's just not good. Yeah, anyway, that concludes my 2 minutes of preparation. Dietmar?
Oh wow, that was fast.
I'm a fast thinker. So you're wondering what's behind that, right? Should I show? If you haven't seen that before, apex.oracle.com/shortcuts. It gives you a list of other shortcuts, really helpful. The Apex team tries to keep them up to date. It links you to documentation of all versions, to tutorials, hands-on labs, everything. Thank you.
So, thank you, Peter, for showing us what not to do and then how to do it properly. So, once we understand, this one is not working. Hold on, Vincent, where are you? Your face is not coming up. So, hold on. There he is. Wonderful. So now that we know where to actually put the JavaScript, have it in files and reference it ideally on the user interface level, we still need to do JavaScript the right way. So as I said before, many people just copy paste the stuff and then they wonder down the road that they really created a mess for themselves. So Vincent is going to show us how to actually not do this and organize your code, having it structured in the file system, using the proper tools, how to build your JavaScript applications, and how to make sure you do it in a professional way.
So Peter, you thought Dietmar stole your content?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You stole mine. All right. I'm going to be a little against Peter because I'm usually not the guy that tells you don't use JavaScript. I'm the one that tells you the opposite. So my name is Vincent, and today I want to talk to you about messy JavaScript in the context of Apex. And just for those who know me, rest assured I won't be putting Apex Nitro down your throat this morning. I was attending Mike Kichwa's session on Sunday, and he showed us numbers about the language that are being used in the frameworks we use. Apex has over 1 million lines of JavaScript. Ords has over 300,000 lines of JavaScript. And then I hear people telling me that we shouldn't use JavaScript. I'm like, wait a minute, there's something going on here. Maybe we shouldn't hide from JavaScript. Maybe we should embrace it. But when you start embracing JavaScript, it's easy to fall into the culprits of the language. And one of the biggest challenges you'll find is when developing a large-scale application is to keep your client-side code base from becoming a huge mess. So today, let's check out 4 tips for our collective JavaScript peace of mind. Tip number 1, keep it out of Apex. Tip number 2, modularize it. Tip number 3, use a modern code editor. And tip number 4, use a style linter. So let's start with tip number 1. In all my years of Apex development, I found that Apex is best used when the least amount of code is stored in the application itself. So it's very common to wrap PL/SQL code in packages and SQL into views. But why don't we do the same for JavaScript? One lazy excuse I often hear is, oh, okay, I only have to write one single line of JavaScript. No, you never have to write one single line of JavaScript. So my opinion is that there should not be any JavaScript business logic within Apex. Only references to objects from external files. So let's have a look at this simple example. We have a simple button which has a dynamic action attached to its onClick event, which triggers an action of type execute JavaScript code. So we might be tempted to put the JavaScript logic directly in here, but that's wrong. The dynamic action structure helps us as developers to understand the structure of the page and what's going on. But it doesn't need to contain any code. It should not. So instead, what we want to do is take that business logic and put it into a file and wrap that business logic into a function. So here we have a top-level function called register kscope, and we put the business logic inside of it. Then if we go back to Page Designer, what we want to do is reference that function name instead of writing the code. So think of PL/SQL packages, which gives context to procedure or function. So when you invoke a PL/SQL API, you call the package name dot function name. In JavaScript, you can achieve the same thing, but it can also go deeper than 2 levels. If you look at the Apex API itself, when you invoke apex.server.process, that's 3 levels deep, and there's no limit. Having such a structure in your functions makes your file much, much cleaner. And if you build a large-scale application, a great pattern would be to have 1 file per Apex page. Each one of those files would be a JavaScript modules, essentially. So let's have a look at that, how we would do it in our previous example. So the first thing we want to do here is define a namespace. You can think of that as a PL/SQL package. And then we define a module name, which is level 2. Let's call it kscope 18. The namespace was odtug. And then we want to define a function name, which is at level 3. Let's call it register. So then we have a very clean structure for our JavaScript, and we can have as many level 2s as we want, as many level 3s as we want. Now back to the Page Designer. If we want to, we would have to change the reference to be our namespace, our module in our function. In that case, that would be kscope odtug.kscope18.register. So no business logic in Apex. Do I still have time?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Tip number 3, use a modern code editor. There are so many good code editors these days. Out of the most popular one, we can find VS Code, Atom, and Sublime. And they're all available for Mac, Linux, or Windows. Okay, thanks. So what's the buzz around these code editors, and why would you want to use them? Out of the many features, we'll find IntelliSense, which is a general term for a variety of features like code completion, parameter information, and some more quick information you can get from the editor. These editors have a rich plugin ecosystem. So the features that comes out of the box with these code editors are really just the start. So plugins allows you to add languages or code linters, text transformations, or anything you can think of to do with your code. There's a plugin for that, I swear. Then there's the command palette. And you don't need to be a keyboard junkie to enjoy these code editors, because all you need to remember is this one shortcut which prompts the command palette, which is a list that pops out of your screen, and then you can do anything, any action you want in there. So just remember the shortcut for the command palette. And then there are snippets. Some of them are built-in, like JavaScript. You get all the JavaScript snippets in these editors. And otherwise, you can also add your own snippets. So it would be interesting for us as Apex developers to add Apex snippets. And this is where I want to get off the slides to demo it. But just know that switching to new... Go back a slide. All good? So switching to a new code editor does take time and to learn all the shortcuts and features, but after a week's worth of learning curve, you would never want to go back. So all I'm saying is embrace the change because it's worth it. All right, let's leave this and go to my editor. I personally use VS Code for like the past week. So same code I was showing here, right? So the command palette, in my case, is Command-Shift-P, and then I get everything. If I want to add a project, then I just type add, and I get all the possible actions. If I want to put text uppercase like this one, I just go Command-Shift-P, uppercase, boom. So I don't need to remember all the shortcuts, just remember the command palette. Now, snippets. So what could be a good snippet for JavaScript? Maybe you want to loop over something, so a for command. You just go here and type for, and you have all the snippets for JavaScript and the previews as well. So what about for each? You just press enter, and boom, you have your snippet. And this comes out of the box with VS Code or Atom or Sublime. But I'm an Apex developer. I want to do Apex snippets, right? So out of the command palette, you can do snippets and configure your snippets. And I did add a custom snippet for JavaScript. So if I go here, I added a snippet for apex.server.process. So here's my snippet. Going back to my app now, if I type Apex, now I see my Apex snippet, and if I press enter, then boom, I have my Apex server process structure. So that facilitates coding in JavaScript a lot. Now, the fourth tip I want to show is use a code linter. A code linter allows you to parse your file and find anomalies in your design guidelines, your code design guidelines. So for instance, let's remove a space here. I'll put a lot of space there. I'll change the indentation. And I'll just open a command line directly in my code editor. That's another shortcut. And I'll type XO, which is my favorite code linter. If I do this, XO, I'll get all of the anomalies in that particular file. So now I can either fix them myself, change the indentation here, missing space here on line 20, or I can do XO -- fix. And then boom, it just fixed it automatically for me. So CodeLinter is a very useful feature I've been using for a long time, and I hope you enjoyed these 4 tips. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Vincent. So, do we have any question on what Vincent was presenting, or even something that Peter was talking about? Please raise your hand if there are. Yeah, over there. Oh, workout. Do we?
We've had some great classes this week on JavaScript. I've learned a lot. This was great information. Are there sources that we can go to take it to the next level? Any recommendations that others have found helpful? Thanks.
Yeah, not trying to steal the thunder again, but Dan McGhan, he will have the last session in this series, and he will give us pointers how to get started and courses and so forth. Yeah.
Well, we've had 2 people talk about keep your code in the file system. Can somebody just talk about when you make a change to that file system, you want people to pick that change up so that you've changed the file, but their browser's cached it. You would do your next release.
Okay. So is the question about how to deploy that then in Apex, or more like with caching when it's? Yeah. Ah, okay. So you mean often when we deploy files on the browser, on the web server, we use caching, and then it might be stale and stuff. When we deploy that in, so there are different mechanisms. One is you could have as a question mark and a parameter with a version number when you reference the file. But when you upload the files to the static application files, Apex will already take care of that for you. You have a default caching of 10 years for that file that is uploaded. When you upload that, it will use the RESTful access to do that, and it will have a version number inside of the URL. So when you upload and change the file, it will be incremented, and you essentially have a new URL, thus bypassing all the caching in the browser. So this is really elegantly implemented with Apex. So I use that a lot, and I hardly put things on the file system for deployment anymore because it works just great. Sometimes you have to, and there are mechanisms, but you typically don't need it that much. Yeah.
This is a yes/no question. Just, can you share? I use the VS Code too, but can you share your snippet for Apex snippet with all of us? Is it possible?
Yeah. We will still have to figure out a way how to deliver the slides, but we will also then include the snippets from Vincent. Yeah. I hope. Thank you, Vincent. This is so kind of you. So, we have a newly appointed ace. Give Menno a hand, please. Yeah, congratulations. Very well deserved. Lots of accomplishments in the Apex community. And he will tell us about the widget architecture, because Apex is using and leveraging the jQuery UI widget architecture and also creating their own widgets that we can use. But I remember when I first had a look at that, I knew a little bit of JavaScript, but that looked weird. I couldn't wrap my head around that. So it's really fundamental to understand how that architecture really ticks. And Menno is going to show us.
Yep. So the other people are doing all the cool stuff, and jQuery UI widgets is not a real new feature. I think it has been around since 2007. But as Dietmar said, not a lot of people know how to deal with it. Maybe you created your own widget, but I don't think many people have. And since we got the interactive grid and we make use of Oracle Jet charts inside APEX, widgets become much more important, and it's good for us to know as APEX developers how to use those jQuery UI widgets. So here we see an example of a calendar, right? It's a common region in APEX, and this is a tree region, also in APEX. What about an inline modal dialog? And here we have a page item. This is a date picker. And this is an example of a autocomplete item. And they all share one thing in common. And what is it? Well, basically, they are like brothers and sisters of each other because they were all born or created in the same factory. And this is the factory which is called the jQuery UI widget factory. And the widget factory gives us a way to build widgets or rich components inside our applications, but do it in a standardized way. So not only do you create the widgets basically the same, so they can look totally different, but you create them in the same way. It also means that the developers in APEX can use them in the same way. So you have all the common features to work with widgets. If you want to know all the details about widgets, I suggest to take a look at the learning library on jQuery.com. There's a topic there for Widget Factory, which has all the information. It's a good read. It's not too long, but it will tell you everything you need to know. And some of the things I will be showing here today. So basically, the first thing you want to know is, okay, where is my widget on my page, right? And to give you a demo, I'll go to my demo application. So I'll run it. It's expired. Let me log in again. And this is my home page. And as you can see, I have a date picker right here. And I have a autocomplete item. So, for instance, I can show all the states in the United States. Once I open up my development console, now I can check which widgets are there available on this page for me to use. So what you first have to know is that under the jQuery object, you've got all these namespaces, and the APEX team creates their own widgets, right? So if we type, for instance, jQuery, the dollar is a shortcut for going to jQuery object, and then .apex, what this will give us are all the widgets which can be used on this page. We're not sure if they are used on this page. So what we can do, for example, I see that here is the tree view. Do you see the tree region on this page? We can check for it. So again, now we're using a jQuery selector to get all the instances of the widgets. So you can do it like this, put a string inside it, start with a colon, and then the namespace. So there will be APEX minus the name of the widget. In this case, it's tree view, and it's all lowercase. And this will give us a jQuery object. And we see that it's got one result. So if we check it out what it is, so if you navigate, then on the left you'll see that it's actually the menu, which is the jQuery widget. So this is a good way to find all the widgets on your page. Now, if we go again back to the console, we didn't see the date picker or the state, the autocomplete widgets right here. And that's because they're in a different namespace. The date picker is actually a native jQuery UI widget. It's not created by the APEX team themselves. So what it means is it's under the UI namespace. And if we take a look there, we'll find all the things that you can use on the page. And one of the things is the date picker, which is right there. Autocomplete, it's not listed here as well, so it must be somewhere else. And maybe you've heard this before, but the autocomplete, they are using the one created by Oracle Jet. So if you type jQuery.oj, which stands for Oracle Jet, you can see all the components you can use from Oracle Jet. So this also means that we can search for plugins or widgets not shown on the page. Maybe there is like a dialog here, so we can search for that as well. So let us try and do that. That will be under the UI namespace, and then dialog. Let's see if it exists. Ah, sorry, I forgot the column. So we found one. And now we can use it. So because this is the correct object, we can use a widget method. So we call the dialog widget. And then we call the open method to open it up and see what it contains. Yes, it exists. So, next on. This is the way to get all the instances of your widgets in your application. These could be all the namespaces. So, for instance, if you have your own widgets, don't put them under the UI namespace or case Apex namespace. Create your own namespace. For example, jQuery.casescope could be a good one. It's the same as Vincent told us, right? To put everything under your own namespace. He used ODTag, I use Casescope. Doesn't really matter. And once you're in that namespace and you're in a widget, if you call the prototype function, it will also give you all the methods available to you. So this could be a good starting point for things which haven't been documented yet. So Apex is creating the JavaScript documentation. So you can find it on apexoracle.com. If you go to 18.1 documentation, there is now this section about the JavaScript API reference. And inside it, and this will be more rich, but now, for instance, we have the grid widget. And here are all the methods for it. So everything else, you can still do it from your browser. Okay, so how do you use a page region widget method? There is this function called Apex region, and then the static ID of your region. If you call the widget function, then you can use the widget to execute some kind of method. Now in 18.1 and onwards, they have a shortcut for it. So it's just apex region.call and then the name of the method. It's much easier. Date picker item. Items are really simple. So if you have a selector and you use the ID of the page item, and then you can easily execute their methods. And when do we have to use widgets? Well, maybe 3 ways. If you want to change options or execute methods, and the last thing is acting on events. So for instance, you can change the orientation of a chart view, right? That's what I'm doing right here. And also I set up a demo. So I go to my widgets. Let's close this one. And here's my chart. And below the chart, I have 2 buttons to change from horizontal to vertical. And I can click those buttons and it just works. So in my application, I have a dynamic action. On the button click, I will do change the option like this. It's the same code. And this is how you change the options of a widget. So even after initialization of the widget, you can change the option and will render itself correctly again. That's how it should work for jQuery UI widgets. And you can also use other things like the refresh. This is for an interactive grid, for example. Acting on events, it's a little bit different. So first of all, you have a jQuery selector, and then you have something called the jQuery on function. And the on function starts with the name of your event. And for jQuery UI widgets, it's always, the first part is always the name of your widget in lowercase. So it could be interactive grid create or date picker create. Always the name of the widget first and then the name of the event. And then you can do stuff with it. So you have to specify a callback function. And the callback function always has these 2 parameters called event and data, which you can use then in your function. And you have to realize also that all widgets, they have a create event. Sometimes I see questions on OTN. How can I do something when the interactive grid is created? Well, it's built in because they use jQuery UI widgets. And the last thing I want to show you is like a really complex feature that you can do. So you have the ability to extend existing widgets. And what you will have to do is to call the widget function. The first parameter is the namespace and the widget name. And then you put in the original one, so it will be Apex Interactive Grid as an object. And then the things you want to change. So I'm overriding here the refresh function, saying I should show an alert message first, and with the underscore super function, you will call the original function. And I found one use case for it that I'm using in my applications. So if I go to my interactive grid, for example, which is right here, you always have this action menu, and then you can download the report, like a CSV. So I have to select it there and download it. So these are quite a few steps, right? And maybe if you haven't enabled HTML, it really doesn't make sense to do so many steps. So there's the download button. What I did on this page was change the interactive grid widget to make it accessible to directly download this as a CSV. So you don't have to remember this code exactly, but what I'm doing here is basically on create, I'm adding another action, which is called MAO, which is my name prefix. Download CSV, and what should the action do? Well, it should download the report with the CSV format. So I use this custom action in a plugin built by Marco Goricki. So I have the ability to extend the toolbar, and the only thing I have to do here is trigger a custom action, and this will be the same name as I've used in my extension. And once I run this page, I have this extra button, and if I click it, I get the CSV immediately. So that will be a use case for advanced widget usage. And with this example, I will conclude my widget talk. Oh, 2 seconds.
Wow, awesome.
Well prepared?
Totally on time. Wow. So, do we have any questions regarding this? No, don't. Martin.
Okay, this is not really a question. It's more of a statement for the person in the front asking about Vincent snippets. In code, you don't actually really need it. If you go, code has something called extensions. And if you look, extensions are like plugins for code. If you look at extensions, search for PL SQL. And there's one called IntelliSense for Apex and Oracle. And it's Trent and Adrian that worked on it. They've actually scraped the entire Apex documentations for PL SQL and all of the Oracle documentation. So literally, you can have everything in there, and it comments it exactly what Vincent showed. It will give you the Oracle-based comments for both the Apex APIs and the Oracle APIs right in code.
Thanks. So, when your application is slow, it doesn't matter how good it is and how functional it is. If it's slow, and people won't like it. Now, our own John Scott, he will show us how to deal with that and make sure your clients will love you.
Thank you, Dietmar. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you. So I wrestled a little bit with the content of this because if we talk purely JavaScript performance, we might talk about how you optimize the code of your JavaScript. However, as the previous presenters pointed out, kind of use native functionality rather than redeveloping the wheel. So I took a slightly different tack on this, which is rather than optimizing the JavaScript itself, what can you do to improve JavaScript usage in your application and make it generally faster and more responsive? So first thing, I've got about 6 different steps to go through here. First thing, order matters where you include JavaScript. Peter kind of hinted at this a little earlier. If you view the source of any web page, it doesn't matter whether it's Apex or not, you will see the code that makes up the web page itself, and its instructions to the web browser rendering engine on how to, produce that page in the web browser. And you'll notice, as a generalized kind of concept, have CSS at the top of the page, JavaScript at the bottom. Years ago, we didn't kind of really obey that rule. If you look at an Apex application, you'll see that they follow this structure, CSS at the top, JavaScript at the bottom. Why? Why should you care? The kind of reason behind it is most web browsers have limited HTTP requests. So whenever you load a web page, the browser doesn't go off and download every image simultaneously, every JavaScript file simultaneously. Chrome, I think, issues 6 simultaneous requests. If you get a 7th resource that you need to download, it sits and blocks until one of those 6 connections becomes available. So what does that mean in real terms? Anybody who developed with Apex 3, 4, and so on, as Peter pointed out, we used to put things in the HTML header right at the top of the page, a reference to a slow JavaScript file. That would block the browser. To the user, it would seem like it had hung. If you include that JavaScript file at the bottom of the page, what you will find is the page renders, it gives the impression to the user that the page is ready, and it loads a JavaScript file at the end. Next section, combine and minify your resources. So what do I mean by that? Imagine in your Apex application you're including 3 different JavaScript files. They could be 3 similar files or completely different files. If you include each of those files, the browser has to go and request each file sequentially, potentially. By combining those files into one big JavaScript file, now the browser just makes one request, gets that file, and it can work with the code inside that file. It's a relatively simple change to make. How do you combine those files into one file? Well, there's lots of different tools available to do this. I generally use this tool, which is Google Closure Compiler. It's produced by the Google developers. There's a web page you can visit, paste your code in, or put a reference to a JavaScript file. There's also a command line tool you can download that will stitch those files together and also optimize them. This is what the web page looks like. In terms of optimizing, what it will do, for example, very simple example, imagine you define a function called hello, and then the next line actually calls that function. The Closure compiler is sensible enough to say, I don't really need to define that function. I'm just going to call the contents of it. So straight away, it's stripped out a bunch of code that would never actually be used. Make sense? Legacy JavaScript. So how many people in the audience aren't on Apex 5 yet? How many people are still using Apex 4? A few. Apex 3? Anybody want to admit earlier to Apex 3? Oh, some. So what I'm talking about with legacy JavaScript is if you have a legacy Apex installation, so Apex 3, Apex 4, and your users are using a legacy browser, so IE 6, 7, 8, 9, or even IE 11 running in compatibility mode, and you make reference to this JavaScript function called HTML get, all of these things combine into a potential blocking situation. So the HTML get AJAX request used to be asynchronous, not asynchronous, asynchronous call, so the browser would actually block until it got the results back, and to the end user it looked like the web page had hung. That behavior is changed in later versions of Apex, so if you upgrade Apex, it's now an asynchronous routine, but there's also a new method. So if you upgrade your old Apex applications, look for places to switch to the new mechanism of AJAX request, which is Apex server.process, which Vincent mentioned earlier. And the end result of that is it doesn't block and wait for the results to come back. You will get a call back once the data actually comes back. So upgrade your Apex instance. Web server considerations, 6 minutes. This might not seem strictly related to JavaScript, but it can help massively with the JavaScript performance of your Apex applications. So in a typical configuration, you might have your end users accessing a Tomcat or WebLogic server ORDS configuration. How many people in the audience use this type of configuration? Quite a few. So what we generally do is put what's known as a reverse proxy in front of this. And there's a number of reasons for actually doing that. First of all, it gives us the opportunity to compress JavaScript files and CSS files to send down to the user's browser. The way you do that in Nginx, you don't need to learn this code, but the way you do that in Nginx is just a couple of little toggles, turn gzip on, and it's going to essentially WinZip compress the JavaScript files. They're going to be smaller files, quicker to transfer down to the user's browser, and the page is going to respond faster from the user's perspective. There's another technique we can use called expiry headers. With expiry headers, we basically say to the end user's browser, you've downloaded this JavaScript file. The next time you need that JavaScript file, you can use the version that is cached on the user's browser's host machine. You don't need to hit the web server again to request that file. I did some performance testing of using gzip and expiry headers, and just turning those two things on, we were able to support twice as many users against a standard ORDS configuration. So big performance boost. Quick word about HTTP2. Anybody using this? So HTTP2 is a new browser web server configuration, really simple to enable in Nginx. Let me just skip to the slide. It's just one keyword. In your Nginx configuration, just put HTTP2. Most modern browsers support it. What that does is, sorry, let me skip back. What that does is, instead of having multiple connections to the server, it has one connection between the web browser and the web server. It multiplexes the user's requests to the web server. In essence, it just goes really fast. It does require SSL, but it's pretty simple to set up. And the performance boost can be pretty impressive. How are we doing on time? 3 minutes. Debouncing and throttling. So what do I mean by debouncing and throttling? So debouncing is grouping multiple sequential calls into one call. Throttling is disallowing more than one execution every X period of time. Make sense? Pretty much my expression when I first kind of looked at that. Like, what is this about? So, quick example, and this is something that we have in quite a few of our Apex apps. Imagine the scenario, you've got 3 select lists, and they all cascade. So you change select list 1, select list 2, refreshes, select list 2 refreshes, so select list 3 refreshes. And every time one of those select lists changes, I'm refreshing 2 charts here. The downside of that is, oops, let me go back. If I change select list 1, those charts are refreshed more frequently than they actually need to be. So just to show you kind of how that looks. So let's load this. So if I change chart 1, these are just random values in the 2 charts, but you'll see they skip multiple times. Behind the scenes, I've just put some console.logs in there, and if I refresh again, you'll see each chart was refreshed 3 times because of the cascading selects. So how do you get around that? Well, with Apex now, latest version of Apex, there's a JavaScript function we can call called Apex util debounce. And essentially what you do is create your own JavaScript function. Don't use dynamic actions to refresh the chart. Create your own function, Apex region .refresh, and use the Apex util debounce, which means if I try and call that function more than once every 500 milliseconds, it will only call it once. So it kind of throttles that usage. the calling usage of that function. If you're not on the latest version of Apex, you can achieve the same functionality using external libraries like Lodash or _JS. Very similar concept, just create a JavaScript function to refresh the charts, and you create a debounced version of that. It looks complicated, but it avoids extra work in the browser. So I think my timing wasn't quite as good as Menno's, but thank you very much.
So, do we have any questions regarding this? Yeah, Jürgen.
John, the question that this said the latest version of Apex. If you not have the latest version, you mean 18.1 is only working in 18.1, this debounce thing? Okay, then we have to talk.
Any other questions or any online? No. Okay. Well, since our application is fast now, and we don't build bugs and errors in there, we're good, right? But in the rare case that we do have some issues, we need to find out how. And there are different ways how we can debug the Apex application, especially instrumenting it with functions for the JavaScript, which is also seen in the console. So we have, once again, another new Oracle ACE associate, so please give Kai a hand.
Thank you. Yeah, so good morning. Thank you. Okay. So first of all, let me ask the other colleagues from the previous talks ask the question: what about the no slides commitment yesterday? Pretty cool. Like, those slides are pretty. Just the necessary things on it. Okay. Yeah, let's start with the debugging JavaScript talk. I don't know if I can fit the 12 minutes because I have so much to tell you. Just kidding. Debugging JavaScript was the main reason why I stopped. Okay, I do it here. Why I stopped learning JavaScript back then. So we didn't have any Chrome dev tools or any software to debug JavaScript pretty good. So when we got the Chrome dev tools and the newest browsers, it's really, really fun to debug JavaScript. Either way, so we don't have that much debugging to do in JavaScript code itself in Apex because the Apex team is doing a really great job on that. So give them a round of applause for that. So I went a long journey yesterday with Peter together in the clubs. So I have to debug myself before beginning the slides here. So nice and polished, you can see my first hint for the best debugging of JavaScript in Apex. So what you have to do to be a successful JavaScript developer in Apex is to use all the utilities the Apex team is giving you, right? So in the newest version of Apex, 18.1, there's a new indicator down there in the debug bar. Did you see that animation? That's great. Thank you, Shakib. So there's a new indicator down there in the debug bar, so the developer can see when JavaScript went wrong on the page, right? So if you build an issue or bug in your software, in your dynamic action, for example, and there's something, something went wrong on this, you will see this indicator down there. You can click on it, and you see this message here. So there's a slow clap from Shakib for the next animation. Thank you. So this dialog is just saying, have a look into your developer console. And this is basically one of the most powerful tools you can use for web development right now. I will skip after, I think, a couple of slides into a live demo for this console stuff, what you can see there and what you can do. And yeah, basically, what you are seeing when you're opening the developer console, even if it's in Firefox or it's in Chrome, you can see those error messages down there in the console, which is in this case showing that there's an uncaught type error and the apex.da.initDA event list is not a function. This is the error which was caught by the Apex engine or the Apex JavaScript in the front end, and yeah, we didn't even see that error on the front end if we just not have opened the DevTools previously. So yeah, the developer knows. So I'm knowing when I'm developing JavaScript, I know this issue. Who's not aware what's happening here? Where to look at? Okay, so apex.da indicates that something is wrong in your dynamic action stuff, but it's not yet that meaningful for us. So in most of the cases, we can just click on this file name right there. You can see it on the same line as the error message itself in the first line, desktop_all.min.js, and so on. When you click on that, and this is what we are usually doing when we are developing, then you are referred to this file, which is a Minify file. So I have to refer to my previous talk or one of the previous talks. When you are minifying your code, you have a good performance, but for debugging, it's not that easy to read, right? So I think Vincent said that we don't even write one line of code. So if you minify your code, everything is on one line. It's basically, couple of thousand or even million lines of code, just minified to a couple of rows. So there's another function what we can do, or there's another functionality inside of Apex what you can use to read this code. So basically, all the JavaScript code which is built in Apex is minified, but it's also provided unminified in the original file. Who did already know this? Just a couple, okay. So if you are clicking, oh, there was another animation, thank you, okay. If you click on the debug, on the debug bar right there, then the page reloads, and I think most of you are clicking on the view debug dialog. You open this pop-up and see if the session state is correct, what the JavaScript engine is doing, but you have more than that. If you're clicking on the debug button, the page is reloading, the debug level is raised, so you have more verbose output. And all the files you are getting, like the desktop min.js stuff, is not delivered as a minified file anymore. It's delivered as the original file which you can read properly. And this is, in case of the dynamic action, a really, really good thing. So I think I will show it into a live demo. Explore the mighty DevTools. You have to do it. So let me just... So I reused an application from one of my talks, this Kscope, and I'm just going to this dynamic action here, which is exactly doing what Vincent was telling you in his talk. It's just calling one function out of a file which I include in the static files and I was referring to. And when I'm just doing something wrong here, so I'm just deleting this right parenthesis, save. We don't have any compiler right now. We don't have an inline interpreter for that. So with some browser extensions, we have something like that, like a linter or something like JSIN to detect those errors directly when you're writing it. But changes are saved. So we built this bug into our application. We refresh the page, and we see this indicator down here. I click on it, see one or more errors have occurred, and so on. I'm opening the Chrome DevTools. switching to the console here. Seeing the same error as on my slides. And you can see desktop all min.js. 2 lines, I can't even read it. I can use this pretty print functionality from Chrome, but this isn't that good either, right? You can see that every function was replaced with just one char, so you can't read it properly. So what I would do is, I saw in the error message that there's something wrong with my dynamic action, so the first thing would be that I see in the look in the dynamic action for the error. But what I'm doing in this example is enabling debug. The error happens again here. We see it on the indicator icon. And now there's another file referred. We don't have that desktop min.js file. We have this jQuery file, which is basically doing the execution of this function. So we can open this file, see there's an exception handling routine, which is better readable right now, and then we can debug this code. So most of the times, like I already said, you don't have to debug that much code which is already built in an APEX. So don't try to find the first bug inside the JavaScript which is built in. But let me just fix this error. When I'm executing code, so this error is not happening anymore, I found the issue. When I have this code, this JavaScript code, as my colleagues are saying previously, I'm including my custom JS file here in the JavaScript area over there. File URLs, I'm including this debug.js.js file, which is basically just doing calculations, just having some fun with numbers, fun with flags. And when I want to debug this code, even if I don't have an exception, but I have a business case or I have a ticket that is saying that my calculation isn't right, I need to debug this code. So I'm seeing that in the Chrome DevTools, in this Sources tab, you can see the files which are referred in my application, which are included. So we already saw this debug.js, debug_js.js file, and we can see our code here. What we can do now in the DevTools, and it wasn't possible before we had those DevTools, we can even do breakpoints in our JavaScript code in there. So follow this, this hint that you are doing your JavaScript in an external file and include it. Otherwise, you can't do it. So if you're doing just JavaScript inline in the dynamic action, you're not able to do such an easy breakpoint stuff. You might be able to do it, but it's not that easy like I'm doing right now here. So I'm opening the file, setting a breakpoint on 3. Executing the dynamic action, and then the interpreter, which is the JavaScript engine, V8 in this case, is stopping at line 3 and showing me in the previously executed line all those variables with the values in it. And now I can step by step go through my code and see the different results, and I can see if there's any error inside this calculation. So you can see that result 3 is not a number in this case, and I think Dan will show some examples why JavaScript is doing it in math and what's the reason for that. 10 seconds, okay, I have to talk faster. So you can find a way to include JavaScript into your application. You even can include the Minify and the normal JavaScript file. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kai.
12 minutes sharp.
So, any questions on this one? No. Then I might want, yeah.
I remember seeing somewhere that you could enter a hashtag MIN hashtag in your JavaScript references.
It is in the user interface attributes, yeah.
Okay.
You can, where you're including global JavaScript in your Apex application, you can use the syntax to, that was basically something I wanted to say anyway. You can include different files, and you can use this hashtag syntax that when you're in the debug mode, the original file will be loaded, and if you're not in debug mode, the Minify file will be loaded. So you have to do it twice to have happy JavaScript developers.
Yeah. Other questions? Then I might want to add one thing to his presentation just as well. It's really nice when you turn on debug and just open the developer console, you will actually see what dynamic actions get executed. So it's really nice to see, just to figure out quickly which one is firing and is the one I want to fire not firing, and why is that. And so that's really helpful, just turning on debug. Yes, the concluding session. Dan will give us the roadmap to success, to really get started, how to get your hands wet with JavaScript, courses online, and so forth. So, Dan, please, thank you.
Hello! Good morning was already overplayed. So when Dietmar asked me to do this talk, I said yes, because that's just what I do, but I was already kind of oversubscribed, doing a lot of work here. So I decided when I got to the ACE meeting, or dinner rather, the other night, there's a lot of talent in this room. Why don't I crowdsource this? So I asked, largely based on who was in the room, these folks here, a simple question. If you were to give an Apex developer 2 recommendations for getting started with JavaScript, what would they be? Now, Peter kept it short and sweet. Peter says, read up on jQuery and learn about Apex JavaScript APIs. Now, Jürgen Schuster and I did a class on JavaScript this week, a very successful, highly attended class. It was packed. People were rejected. And I couldn't agree more. When it got to the part on manipulating the DOM manipulation, we chose jQuery, even though some folks would say today that, you know, we're getting to the point where you might not need jQuery. There's even a website called You Might Not Need jQuery. But it's bundled with Apex, so why not? It's a great intro into JavaScript. Also, the Apex JavaScript APIs are very important because although jQuery is great, it knows nothing about Apex. So you got to learn those too. Jorge went right for a shameless plug. I would send them to my JavaScript and CSS talk for PL SQL developers. Smooth, smooth. Now, John, he says that he found the editors and plugins for editors to be very helpful when learning. And you've seen examples of this already with autocomplete and IntelliSense type stuff. So definitely important to get into that. He also recommends JS Fiddle. And if you've never seen a fiddle before, JS Fiddle specifically, this is a website completely dedicated to, on the left panel, you can pick libraries very easily. And then you have sections here where you can edit HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code, and then see the output immediately. So this is definitely a great tool. Highly recommend this. And of course, we have one as well, Live SQL for working with Oracle Database. Christoph said he's had great success with Pluralsight's Node.js course, and I couldn't agree more. Frankly, Pluralsight is one of my go-to resources for learning in general about IT stuff. So this is a website dedicated to video-based online training. You do have to pay for it, but it's worth every penny. And they have not only just content on Node.js, but a lot of different cool technology as well. And he also recommends this guru on YouTube who has a fun function channel. So if you want to have some fun while learning your JavaScript, you can't beat this guy. He's got over 150,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel. Good stuff. I'm not sure if his accent's real. I'll let you be the judge. Adrian recommended both a website and a book. So MDN is the Mozilla Developer Network, and chances are, if you're Googling things on JavaScript, you'll probably land here quite a bit anyway. So very good resource. He also recommends a book, JavaScript, the Definitive Guide. And if you've read PL SQL, the Stephen Feuerstein's PL SQL book, we often call it the Bible. This is the equivalent of in the JavaScript world. Very good content. Other than that, he recommends the web page inspection tools, which you just saw a minute ago. You definitely have to learn these tools. The first time I ever saw anyone use them was at a Kscope years and years ago. It was Patrick Wolf, and I thought, what is this black magic? I must have this. And believe me, you need to learn how to use these developer tools. John Snyders, he seems to be a big fan of Douglas Crawford. He thinks not only should you read his book, JavaScript, The Good Parts, but you should also check out his website. And now that we've had a recommendation of both JavaScript, the Definitive Guide, and JavaScript, the Good Parts, I have to show you a little joke in the community. I'll give you a moment to take that in. Moving on. Now, JB is the exact opposite of Peter. JB had a lot to say, and I'm not going to read all this. I'll just paraphrase. So on the left, he's saying, you should pick a topic, and you should build an app with that, for that in different languages, frameworks, and libraries. He also disagrees with me. He thinks you shouldn't start with jQuery, that you should start with just native JavaScript now and get a good understanding of the DOM. That's fine, different opinions. He wasn't done there. He also said that you should make sure you comment your code and revisit your code as you learn and refactor things. On the right, he says to know your audience. So if you're in an enterprise and you know your users are working with perhaps older browsers, that you should be aware of that and maybe not use certain features so that your code actually runs on those browsers. He was done at that point. And Vincent, he was one of my favorites. The discussion with him was interesting, to say the least. He had a lot to say as well. And Vincent really, really wants you to learn JavaScript. In fact, Vincent, he thinks you need to master JavaScript. And it reminded me of this, my opinion is a little more nuanced. It reminded me of this image the Apex team used to float around. And Mark Ziefs, is he here? Mark lovingly handcrafted all of these icons. And notice that the rad developer in the middle is definitely the coolest looking of them all. But the truth is, we have all kinds of developers in the Apex community. And you might be one of these business users here on the left, and you're able to create applications, and you may not even know a whole lot of SQL or PL SQL even, but you're able to get the job done, and I think that's fine. You could probably just learn a little bit about dynamic actions and get away with it. But when you cross over, or if you're interested in crossing over, then, yeah, you got to step up your game. And so here's some advice from Vincent, and when you're ready to take on some more advanced stuff, definitely pay attention. So first thing he says is pay attention to web tech leaders that take complicated subjects and make them easy to understand. He lists a few here. He also says to embrace ES6 because it's going to make the code you're writing simpler over time. He says to read code from open source projects, popular open source projects, because of course that's how you learn from the best. And then go ahead and fork those repos and play around with it. Do something different, change it, make it your own. All very good advice. And he left us with some final thoughts. There is no escaping JavaScript. As a large-scale app grows, requirements will grow too, and you can't do everything in PL SQL. Don't be the average dev. Has anyone seen this application before? A lot of folks here. Doesn't surprise me. The first time I saw this application was a few Kscopes ago, and it's an Apex application, but it doesn't look a thing like Apex. And the reason is that it's pretty much entirely written in JavaScript. Highly interactive, very impressive application. As a seasoned JavaScript developer, I found myself looking at this thinking, how in the world was it put together? The author of this application is Gemma Wood. And Gemma, I ran into her after her presentation, and I told her I was really impressed with it. And she said, I started learning JavaScript a few years ago, and it was after you gave a talk on JavaScript and Apex. So Gemma just made this decision. She was going to learn JavaScript after that. And you see the result. She did it. Will you be the next Gemma Wood? If you're feeling a little inspired at this point, I went ahead and took all of these recommendations and turned them into links. I see a lot of folks taking pictures. It's unnecessary. By the way, my blogs are already on Twitter, so if you follow me on Twitter, you can go there. And at the very end, there is one picture you can take, which will have a link to all these slides so you can download it. So of course, Pluralsight, as I mentioned, is one of my favorites. Pluralsight has paths, like tons of paths where you can learn a particular topic, start with beginners, move into intermediate and advanced topics. Definitely recommend that, and there's some links here to individual courses as well. Books, of course, I have the two that we talked about already, the definitive guide and the best parts. But there's also another one, You Don't Know JS. See what he did there? So great content, and you can consume this either, it's on GitHub, you can consume it for free, or you can pay for it if you want to help support the author. He has a paid version as well. Of course, I still recommend jQuery. Now, the original author of jQuery, his name is John Resig, he went to work for a company called Code Academy, and they're dedicated to online tutorials for learning this kind of stuff. One would assume they have a good tutorial for jQuery, so I put that up here. There's a book that a lot of people seem to like about learning jQuery called A Smarter Way to Learn jQuery. I put a link to that. And of course, the API documentation for jQuery, which will be your go-to source as you're learning that library. I have links here to the APEX JavaScript APIs. Depending on the version of APEX that you're using, you can choose the appropriate link. All you really need to do is spend a few hours just kind of getting an overview of this, and then later when you know, I got to do something specific, you can come back to and dig into the specific APIs you need. For developer tools and fiddles, I think it's probably best that if you do get into JavaScript, you start using Chrome as your primary browser for development. So I put a link here into their developer tools. Lots of great resources there for learning about that. And of course, JS Fiddle is not the only fiddle out there. There are some others, and they each kind of have their own specialty. Some are a little bit better at one thing than others. Some have maybe some better getting started content, for example. So spend a few time with each, a little time with each, and figure out which one you like the best. As far as editors and plugins go, obviously VS Code is very popular these days, so I put a link up to that one, as well as the extensions. Atom, very popular as well. And of course, NetBeans, if you're doing Jet development, there's some specifics, some help in that editor for Jet. For YouTube, there's a link here to the Fun Function channel, as well as a video that I really enjoyed learning from. This is what the heck is the event loop anyway? I know that sounds complicated, but when you're feeling adventurous, give it a click, you'll learn. Here's some links to those web leaders that Vincent mentioned, if you want to follow them on Twitter. And finally, just a few other links. So there's a weekly newsletter that you can get for JavaScript-specific content. You can sign up for that. 30 Seconds of Code is a cool website that you can go to get a little example on a daily basis. They'll pull one out at random. You can flex your muscles that way. Of course, I had to include a link to Jorge's plug, so if you want to go for that one. And then finally, to the Mozilla Developer Network. Now, in addition to being a reference, if you look in the left-hand column, you'll see that they have tutorials for learning JavaScript and getting started with this technology. Fantastic content. So if you do want to take a picture, this is the picture you want to take, and you can download these slides and start learning JavaScript today. Thank you.
25 seconds. Awesome. Wow. Also very much on time. Thank you, Dan. So, no more excuse. Yes.
Where would you send the people when they want to have live chat support for JavaScript?
Apex World. You sign up for Apex World, you get access to the Slack channel, and there's a JavaScript part in there that you can get help from.
Damn it, my last slides are somehow gone. Well, something crashed. So, any more questions? None here, no online. Well, then I can just say thank you to all of you for being part of this great conference. I want to give once again a shout out to the Oracle APEX team who have created this wonderful product and support us here at Kscope every year. So please give them a hand. And actually, many of us bet our careers on them, so guys, don't screw it up. Yeah, I think the closing session will begin in 20 minutes. Where is that?
Northern Hemisphere, so around the corner, where we started the session. So, yeah, quick break, and then we'll have the closing ceremony.
Yeah. I think we will also make all of the slides and the snippets available somehow. I think it would be best if you just follow us on Twitter. We will make sure that we put up blog posts, references stuff, and retweet everything. So I think it will be hard to miss. Okay. Thank you.